this moment is different than any other moment in our history. There have been many cases of police brutality, and police criminality, especially as it pertains to the killing of Black and brown people. But this is the first time that I can recall in my lifetime that the law enforcement community has joined the civilian community in expressing complete displeasure and demanding for further justice against their own colleagues in law enforcement. I think it would be wise for us to utilize this moment as an opportunity to begin not only the discussion about police reform, but the implementation of those ideas and measures that can make that a reality.
I'd like to talk to you about that in a moment, but I also want to get your thoughts on why you think the scale of turbulence is playing out. Some people think it's the worst since the death of Martin Luther King.
Yeah, there's a different protest culture here now. I think people are still operating under like a 1980s kind of mentality about protest demonstration. The reality is that now, in large part, there are extremist organizations, anarchist organizations, violent extremist organizations that have infiltrated many of these organizations and the demonstrations. They come with a different agenda, a different motivation, and they can cause a tremendous amount of chaos and sometimes violence and a lot of property destruction, because some of these extremist organizations are bent on civil war, and they'll use any methodology in order to achieve that goal. So you're not just seeing the ideas and actions of the quote unquote conventional protest organizations, but you're seeing a violent extremist organizations that infiltrate and use these events as an opportunity to further their particular goals.
And Mark, are you talking in that case of both people on the left and the right, so people, white supremacists, anarchists, and anti-fascist groups?
Yeah, I mean there are opportunists. There are opportunists on both ends of the spectrum. I think it's important to continue these discussions relating to that, and I think it's also important for the quote-unquote conventional, and I hate to use that term, but quote-unquote conventional organizers of these type of protests to reject the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and to instead call out those organizations, reject them from their events and their own organizations, and recognize and realize that many of these extremist organizations are there for chaos, to cause chaos. Many of them encourage, in their doctrine, they encourage and promote civil war and race wars. You know, just think about it. You have actual white supremacist extremist organizations involved in some of these protests alongside of Black Lives Matter groups. So this is something that we have to keep an eye on and really begin to address.
There is, of course, concern that there are white supremacists still deeply embedded in police forces around the United States, and of course that does differ from state to state. Do you believe that's the case?
I think there is ample evidence and indication that groups, I don't know what level, there has been some infiltration in law enforcement, and that possibly could give some additional explanation as to why so many of these incidents, race-based violent criminal incidents committed by law enforcement, although it's not rampant, but there are instances of it, why these things happen. I think if we're going to examine the role that the extremists, violent extremist organizations have in the protest movement, then we are obligated to, at the same time, examine the role that they may have in our very institutions that include the police departments and law enforcement agencies across.
So this is something that we've looked at from afar that has happened repeatedly in the United States. A disproportionate number of black people killed at the hands of police officers. What is it going to take to reform police forces across the nation?
What would really take a very strong discussion on race itself and the acknowledgement of the history and the legacy of the enslavement of African people here in the United States. And it's an uncomfortable conversation for some, but it's a necessary conversation for all. Until we get to the point where we can have discussions about our issues that surround and support race and racism, then we're just spinning our wheels. And there has to be a real commitment from government, not just lip service, not just the bending of a knee, although those things are helpful. But there has to be really some substantive movement towards an overall reform. Police reform is direly needed here in the United States.
And how critical are effective charges? We heard the Minnesota police chief saying he believes the other 3 officers are complicit in the death of George Floyd. How will effective prosecution of these officers make a difference?
Effective prosecution, more so than charges, will make a significant difference. But in the immediate, I know many of the demands of the demonstration surround the arrest of the other 3 police officers. In the immediate, that would make significant difference in as far as quelling perhaps some of the anxiety from the quote-unquote conventional protest community. But I think people are much more sophisticated than they were. They understand that arrests are not adequate. There must be a successful, committed prosecution and ultimate conviction of criminal police officers.
Mark, we hope things calm down very, very quickly in the States. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Bev.